Imagine being promised to a stranger before you could read your own name, and growing up knowing your wedding would be a contract, not a choice. In medieval Europe, womanhood was scripted long before girlhood ended. Marriage as transaction, childbirth as mortal risk, justice as spectacle, and fear weaponized as faith. Chapter 1. Marriage as contract, not choice. In much of medieval Europe, marriage operated like a ledger entry. Among nobles, daughters were instruments of policy, pledged to secure borders, calm feuds, or expand estates. Betrothals could be fixed in early childhood, and under canon law, a girl of around 12 was considered marriageable. Consenting to this future often meant nodding in a room full of men who had decided it already. Peasant families had little more freedom. Lords could pressure unions that supported manorial needs, while kin balanced rents, labor, and survival. The church preached consent, but in practice, it could be a formality, especially when a girl stood before parents, priest, and community. Some later insisted they had never agreed at all. Others were pushed to accept under threat, debt, or the heavy promise that this is what's best. Marriage changed a woman's legal existence. Under Femme, Covert, a wife's identity folded into her husband's. Property control shifted, lawsuits were brought in his name, movement could require his permission. Scripture and custom reinforced the hierarchy. The husband ruled, and the wife obeyed. Cloaked in sacrament, the household became a small court where law, economy, and theology converged, and the verdict on autonomy was usually the same. Chapter 2. Childbirth, the most dangerous day. For medieval women, childbirth was the most perilous threshold they would cross. Without anesthesia, antiseptics, or modern interventions, labor could switch from routine to fatal in an afternoon. Deliveries happened at home, usually supervised by midwives whose expertise was practical but not formally trained. Even noble chambers draped in fine cloth could be breeding grounds for infection. Straw underfoot, reused tools, and poor sanitation. Mortality hovered like a shadow. Estimates put maternal death as high as 1 in 10 or 12 births. Obstructed labor, hemorrhage, and childbed fever were common killers. Cesarean sections, when attempted, were almost never performed on living mothers. Priests were sometimes summoned to a woman in labor, not to bless the child, but to offer last rites. Yet pregnancies followed pregnancies. Marriage meant procreation. Status and security were tied to fertility, especially the production of male heirs. Noble women might withstand 10 or more confinements in hope of dynastic continuity. Peasant women balanced fields, hearths, and newborns, their bodies taxed by malnutrition and toil. The risk was constant, the choice illusory, the courage ordinary and immense. Chapter 3. Justice as deterrence, shame, scars in the crowd. Medieval. Justice prized fear over reform. Law drew from feudal custom, royal decree, and church doctrine, and the spectacle was part of the sentence. Women accused of moral offenses often faced public humiliation, stripped to smocks, heads shaved, marched through streets to the jeers of neighbors. The lesson was communal, the shame permanent. For property crimes or repeated offenses, courts could order mutilation, ears severed, fingers removed, faces branded, penalties that doubled as lifelong announcements of guilt. The church's courts prosecuted fornication, blasphemy, and heresy. The Decretum Gratiani warned that female speech itself was suspect, likening a talkative woman to a leaking roof. The message was clear. Silence was virtue. Dissent, sin. Torture, theoretically regulated, slid in with royal warrants and inquisitorial zeal. Confessions were prized as proof. Agony was the tool that produced them. Women's lower legal standing and social vulnerability made them easier to coerce and easier to condemn. Ducking, flogging, pillorying, and the stake were not merely penalties. They were public theater designed to fix obedience in memory. Chapter 4. Fear with a Face, the Making of the Witch. By the late Middle Ages, communal anxiety found its emblem, the witch. Misfortune needed an agent, failed harvests, sudden illness, infant deaths, and accusations often landed on older, poor, or isolated women whose difference read as danger. The Church's intellectual framework gave superstition a spine. Theologians long framed women as spiritually weaker and thus more vulnerable to temptation. That logic hardened into a manual with the Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, the Hammer of Witches, which insisted that female lust and spiritual frailty made women natural conspirators with the devil. Trials followed a grim script, a quarrel or rumor, an arrest, imprisonment, interrogation, and torture, until the story demanded by authorities took shape. Flying by night, consorting with demons, blighting fields. Denial meant more pain. Confession sealed the pyre. Burnings were framed as purification. In practice, they were a lesson in smoke and ash. Across medieval and early modern Europe, 3/4 or more of the accused were women. They were not monsters. They were mirrors for a society anxious about control, made to answer for storms it could not predict and illnesses it could not cure. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Silence. These were not isolated cruelties. They were structural. Arranged marriages managed property and politics. Childbirth risks enforced a quiet fatalism. Gender justice kept women visible only as examples. Witch panics transformed suspicion into policy. Each pillar supported the others, a system calibrated to keep women's labor essential and their voices marginal. Religion sanctified the hierarchy. Custom policed it. Law punished its challengers. Even where statutes acknowledged a woman's right to own goods or present a case, practice curtailed it. Households functioned like tiny states, communities like courts, town squares like stages. To survive was to learn the lines, to speak softly, to count risk the way others counted coins. And yet, within these confines, women resisted and adapted, leveraging kin networks, negotiating marriage terms where they could, relying on midwives, saints, and one another. Some won cases, some fled bad matches, some taught daughters how to read the room and bend without breaking. Their victories were often small, their names rarely recorded, but they stitched possibility into the seams of a rigid world. Conclusion: counting the cost. The medieval order did not merely limit women, it built institutions to manage them, economically, legally, spiritually. In every coerced betrothal, every perilous birth, every public shaming, and every flame-lit square, we glimpse how hierarchy secures itself by turning bodies into messages and fear into law. History doesn't sleep. It speaks through what endures, the contracts, the court rolls, the sermons, and the stories. If we listen closely, we also hear what's missing: the voices stifled, the choices foreclosed, the lives narrowed to duty and danger. The question is not whether the past was harsh, it is, what did that harshness build, and for whom? Which force most shaped medieval womanhood? Marriage markets, mortal childbirth, gendered justice, or fear-driven persecutions? Tell me what you think, and what echoes you still hear today.